All right. Good evening, everyone. It's now 6 o'clock, and I call to order the workshop of the Victoria City Council. Our workshops are informal, and with that, we're going to dive right into our agenda this evening. We have one item on the agenda, which is the cannabis zoning discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Community and Economic Development Director, Jen Brewington, and City Attorney Bob Vos, who will kick us off this evening. So Jen, are you going to start?
Yes.
All right. Ms. Brewington, please.
Thank you. All right, just some background for you. So the state of Minnesota recently legalized the recreation use of cannabis through the passing of an adult use recreational cannabis legalization bill, 73-57. Legalization of possession and home growth will be effective August 1st of 2023. Legal sales are expected to begin by January of 2025. And just letting you know, there is a local retailer who is interested in opening a small dispensary within Victoria. So just some zoning information. So the Minnesota Office of Cannabis Management, the OCM, which is being created at the moment, will eventually license, renew, and regulate cannabis and hemp businesses throughout Minnesota. Cities may not totally prohibit cannabis businesses licensed by the OCM, but we are able to basically put on our own restrictions to make sure we've got the operations that are in schools, daycares, parks, etc. And then cities may also limit the number of retail cannabis businesses to one per every 12,500 residents. And then before adopting such regulations, cities may adopt an interim ordinance, which is a moratorium, to temporarily prohibit the establishments of a cannabis business in the city. So with that, the moratorium piece, this would temporarily halt the establishment of any cannabis-related businesses within the city limits, allowing time for further study and evaluation of the potential impacts and regulatory framework. This approach provides an opportunity to carefully plan and develop appropriate zoning regulations, licensing requirements, and public safety measures. And just for you to note, I just want to make sure that we are keeping in the back of our minds the potential economic benefits that this could have for the community as well. So with that, just wanted to have a conversation tonight. Do we want to license the businesses that we have within our community, or do we want to put in place an interim ordinance? And we do have our attorney here as well, who's been working with our other local cities in the state to kind of discuss what we should do with this. So with that, I'll let you have a conversation around this.
Thank you, Ms. Brewington. Attorney Vos, do you have anything to add to this conversation before we start battering you with questions?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, just a few points, kind of in a little bit of random order, but sort of fill in a couple of to add some context to a couple of the points that the Community Development Director made. First thing is that this idea about adopting some sort of regulations now, licensing requirements, other regulations now, or considering a moratorium, that's right. That's the right way to characterize the question. But to be clear, a city's ability to license these businesses would just be a very short-term temporary thing. That could only be in place until the state starts licensing, and the state agency, of course, was just created by this new law. That agency is sort of getting staffed up right now. They're going to have to write rules, regulations, state agency regulations, and that process, staffing up, getting a structure, and then adopting rules is expected to take them into next year. So although it's going to take them, the state agency, a little time to get organized, we're talking about a relatively short period of time for a city to have its own licensing regime in place, a regime that would have to go away when the state regime is up and running. And so because of that, that's the reason that a lot of our cities, and I think a lot of cities around the state, and I think to some extent the League of Cities, are leaning toward, or maybe even encouraging cities to think more about moratoria, the plural of moratoriums. So a lot of cities are thinking about adopting a moratorium simply because it's seemingly more sensible to just say, pause, wait a minute, let's see where things are going to shake out, rather than attempting to jump into the void for a very short period of time with something that's going to have to go away. So that's just the first point about why it is that you're hearing a lot about cities considering a moratorium, even cities that after the last go-around, after what I've been calling 3.2 marijuana, low-grade marijuana, which was legalized last session, not this immediately last before this last. Even though cities had the power to adopt moratoriums then, because it was a low-level intoxicant that was being legalized. Many cities just said we're not going to worry about adopting a moratorium. And so a lot of cities thought about it and said, no, we're not going to. A lot of those cities that said no last time are saying yes to a moratorium this time, because this is obviously a much more extensive, higher level of intoxicant, more uncertainty about how the state rules are going to play out, and more uncertainty about what cities' roles are going to be going forward. So because of all of that, I think more cities are going to tend toward adopting a moratorium. The moratorium, as I think staff just indicated, could run through the beginning of 2025. That may well be longer than your city or any city needs, because again, the state regulations, the state regulatory scheme should be known by sort of at least by mid next year, so a bit in advance of 2025. But that is the longest period of time. And then just two kind of detailed points about what you heard in the staff PowerPoint. And this is probably just edifying to me or important to me. The law is written oddly. The law is written to try to recognize that cities should have some role in regulating this new kind of product that's going to be legal. But the way the city role is written, it's actually written as though cities can adopt what the statute calls time, place, and manner restrictions. And that's odd, and maybe this is just a fun thing for lawyers, but that's odd because time, place, and manner restrictions are normally talked about in the context of the First Amendment. That's where the government can limit how long you can speak. For example, at your council meetings, you've opened up the forum here, but of course the mayor can limit the amount of time that a person can have the microphone. That's a time, place, and manner restriction on speech. We don't usually talk about zoning or talk about what uses can be allowed in the city in terms of time, place, and manner. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this state agency understands that phrase and what authority they give to cities in their rules, their yet to be adopted rules. The other thing to understand is that should you go forward with the moratorium, obviously that'll be something for you to talk about and decide, but should you go forward with the moratorium, at the end of that, cities have the ability to just opt out of this and say, we're not going to worry about this. We're going to let the state issue licenses. We're going to let the county, I think Carver County will certainly assume a role in this. We're going to let the state and the county have control, have regulatory authority over this. What you lose in doing that, if that were to be the choice you make, is that you have the power under the statute to limit the number of licensed retail businesses, the places where you can go and buy pot. You have the power to limit the number of those places to as few as one per 12,500 in population. Obviously, that's a number that's relevant here. And so if you don't step into the regulatory arena, if you decide to just opt out, you can't impose that limit, and there will be as many retail businesses in town as the market would support or as want to be here in your city. There's a caveat on that because the county can establish a limit as well countywide, and that limit gets pressed down onto cities. And so I can't say literally there would be as many as the market would bear, but there could be more than one or two if the city doesn't elect to step into that regulatory arena at the end of a moratorium, if that's the direction you go. So I said a lot there, and I don't know that that was clarifying at all. There are still a million gaps in this legislation that are going to have to get filled by this state agency, but just to give you a little sense of the nuance that's going on behind the scenes about how this is going to get rolled out.
Got it. Couple questions for you in regard to the limiting to the 12,500. So if we say we want to pay attention to that number, we can go, we want one up to 12,500. Do we have to get to 25,000 before we can get 2, or can 2 come after that tip?
Yeah, Mayor, it's obviously the right question to ask. I mean, that authority for cities to limit the total number of licenses is an important thing to a lot of city officials, and so it's the right question. I can't answer the question, unfortunately. It's gonna have to be further clarified by the rules, and here's the reason why. If you read the statute literally, it would appear to any reader, I think, of normal intelligence, that what that means is that you can limit it to 1 for the first 12, up to 12,500, and then you are required to allow 2 for 12,500 to 25,000. You can limit it to 3 from 25 to the next 12,500 above that. et cetera. That would be, I think, the intuitive way to read the statute, but that is not what the League of Cities lobbyists, regulatory and legislative affairs people believe they had negotiated for. They believed that the limitation could be 1 per 12,500, but that the limitation started at 25,000. I realize that doesn't make a lot of sense what I just said, but that the cap could be put in place up to 25,000, and then it was intended to be every 12.5 after that was one additional license. So I wasn't in the room, so I can't answer what was intended or what was meant to be written, but reading it literally, I think that the fairest reading is that a city has the authority to limit it to 1 up to 12.5, 2 up to 25, et cetera.
Okay, so the next question that I have for you, if we do agree to allow this by ordinance, we would write the ordinance in such a way, and I'm looking at you too, Sardi, write the ordinance in such a way that at whatever time the state took over, our authority goes away? Is that basically how that would work?
That is basically how it would work, and the follow-up question that, Mayor, you would ask appropriately, or somebody would, is sort of when does it go away then, right? And what action, what thing causes a local licensing scheme like that to go away? And again, I'm afraid I don't really know the answer. I think the answer is that when the state first begins to issue licenses, so the first, I guess you could say the first day that a license is issued from the state, all local licensing regimes would have to go away. But exactly, how you would calculate that and implement that, I think, is a fair question. I don't really understand the answer to it, but that's my understanding, is that the intention would be that the gap that exists now would have to go away when the state is in the business of issuing licenses.
Okay. So in this ordinance, we would probably have to write some requirements around what licensing would look like. And of course, we'd want to mirror that as closely to whatever the state was going to do as possible. But we don't know what that is at this point, because it's going to be a year before they can stand that office up and probably be functioning. Theoretically and practically, probably within a year. It's going to be a year before they can do anything. Okay.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, I'm sort of nodding my head. I think that's a reasonable understanding. I think that there may be advocates on either side. I don't know that there are sides on this issue, but you know what I mean. Advocates that have different interests in this issue that would think that the state could have regulations in place sooner than that. It is an expedited rulemaking proceeding that the state agency is going to engage in. So in theory, it could be done in as few as, I guess, 4 months. I think that's unlikely, but in theory, it could be done that quickly. And then, Mayor, to your other point, and I think you all know this, but I'll say it out loud, the legislative process is sometimes called sausage making because there's a lot of conversations that happen that are like sausage making, I guess, and you all know what I mean. The rulemaking process can be very much that way too, and you can appreciate that there are quite a few different interest groups here that are going to weigh in on the rules. And so I just want to back up your point, Mayor, which is that to try to speculate about what rules are going to come out of this state agency at this stage is really, really speculative. I mean, it's really hard to guess at what's going to happen.
All right. Do you have any sense of cities in Minnesota that have written their ordinances and are going to be the licensing agency until the state gets into the game?
Yeah, and I hesitate to answer that question because it's going to sound like I'm advocating for one direction for you versus another, which I'm not at all, of course. But at least in our firm's experience, we had a couple of cities that after the first legalization of what I've called 3.2 marijuana, after that, they deployed quickly licensing regimes. And the cities that did that now, going on a year ago, I think want to leave those in place and just sort of augment them to address the new products that theoretically could become available. And so that's where we're seeing cities have some interest in licensing. Quite candidly, and again, I don't want to sound like I'm advocating for something, I don't think I know of any of the 43 or 4 cities we work with that are seeking to newly come up with licensing regimes knowing well that they're going to go away within a year or less. I mean, there is a fair amount of work, frankly, staff work and other work that would have to go into actually crafting this. Maybe staff has already gotten a head start on that. And so I don't know how far along you are, but that's been the experience that we've seen so far.
So the logical thing is to compare and contrast this to a liquor license. Is that a fair comparison? Could we take out the word liquor and insert the word cannabis and be there?
Mayor and Council, it's fun that you asked that question. So, within our group, and I'm sure the same conversations were had in other interested groups, but the question was sort of, is liquor licensing or tobacco licensing the better analog? Because there are some similarities between the two ways we do those things, but there are some differences too. And so, which is the better sort of starting point? I think your point is well taken. Obviously, there are some characteristics of liquor as a impact on society or as a thing that we deal with that's more similar to an intoxicant like cannabis than tobacco. There are some obviously similarities with how tobacco is sold as well. But yes, we've tended toward liquor licensing, I think, is the sort of better starting point. So, yeah.
Okay. Council. Interesting topic. What questions do we have? Councilmember Gunderson, please.
Say we license someone, a business, and the state then comes through, establishes theirs, and then turns that business down for whatever reason. What recourse would that business have to argue their case? When would the city be held liable for licensing someone that the state turned down for selling? Does that make sense?
Mayor and Council, the question makes perfect sense. I'm afraid if I tried to give an answer, it would make less sense. So I'm hesitant to answer. I actually don't really know. I think liability, like literally legal liability, gets sued for damages for having issued a license and then have that business fail to get a license at the state. It would be extraordinarily difficult to literally sue the city for damages, because obviously you've allowed a business to make some money in a scenario where the state has said they shouldn't be allowed to make money doing that. So it'd be hard to say that the city is at fault, I think, or has caused damage in that circumstance. But that said, I get the problem that you're talking about. It's obviously a problem to have a business be established in town and then have to go away because a different regulatory body a few months later or more than a few months later says no. But I can't answer.
Okay. Yeah. Time, place, and manner.
Yeah.
My question's around manner. We could literally set the guidance to you can sell only bongs. Is that what manner would mean in terms of in that rule?
Well, now, Mayor and Council member, that now you're getting into A+ territory on your bar exam there. That's exactly right. So in that phrase, time, place, and manner, if cities really have the power to regulate the manner of retail sales, for example, or any of there's 16 different categories of marijuana-related businesses that theoretically can be licensed, from growing to manufacturing, producing, to the retail end of things, a bunch of different things that go on in that process. If you can regulate the manner of that, that sounds like complete regulatory authority over the industry. And that is clearly not what was intended. The legislature had intended to take away some authority from cities and say the state is going to make decisions about who should be in this business and not, and how it should operate. Cities, you're going to have a limited role.
Yep.
So, but you're right to ask the question, but that's the words they use. That's the word the legislators use in writing this. And so I'm fascinated by that question too. How far will the authority to impose manner restrictions go? The rules are going to have to speak to that, right? The state rules are going to have to say something about that, because you're quite right. A city may say, fine, the state issues licenses, but we're going to mandate 19 different things on retail businesses that are very expensive. Well, doesn't that effectively limit or cause to go away those businesses? Yes, it does. I think we know that from other contexts. So it's a great question. That's going to be regulated for sure by the state agency. They're going to adopt regulations about that.
And then my last question would be, if council doesn't have any, would it benefit us to hear from the one business that may have done research on this topic and add that to the conversation, if he's willing.
You know, I want to hear from you. I certainly do. But I got a couple other questions. And I want to make sure that other council members have a chance to ask questions too. So before I go ahead, council, other questions?
I just had a general question
Councilmember
about
Wright.
any further guidance the state's given at this point. I know it's a year out, but I mean, have we seen all the detail that the state has given at this point? I mean, is there anything that we should be thinking about beyond what we've, you know?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, that's a good question. That one I can somewhat more definitively answer. The answer is no. You know, the only body, given that this law creates a new agency that will be let's call him the cannabis czar, given that agency has been created, that's really the only place that any speaking or any direction or any information really could originate from. And they just haven't, that they're in infancy at this stage, and they just haven't started talking, so to speak. So yeah, there has not been anything. You know, the one thing the legislation says that's maybe useful to understand is that in addition to adopting rules that will be informative to cities, this agency is directed to work with cities and come up with a model ordinance, a model time, place, and manner regulatory ordinance. Not dissimilar, there are some other examples where state agencies have done that with cities, the DNR with shoreland regulations, the Public Utilities Commission with right-of-way regulations. So there are some examples of that. So it should be, in other words, what this state agency comes out with as advice to cities in the form of a model ordinance should be super specific, right? I mean, it's going to be very detailed and specific. It just has not been crafted at all at this point.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Councilmember Roberts, please.
You mentioned, I believe I heard you right. Like, so if you said if there's a moratorium, we put a moratorium in place, but then you said, but if we don't regulate, we could lose the ability to limit it to the one per 12,500. Are you talking about once that moratorium's over, if for some reason in 2025 the state doesn't have their stuff together, that would be when we would have to do something? Is that what you're saying, I guess?
Yeah, Mayor and Council member, that's exactly right. You're right that you don't need to jump into the field today or tomorrow in order to preserve those rights that I'm talking about. If you elected to instead go the direction of a moratorium through beginning of 25 or sooner, if things shake out that way, but as long as through 2025, if you do that, if you take that approach, you have preserved your right, your full regulatory authority right, including the right to limit the number and to have these time, place, and manner restrictions. So there is no rush to preserve your authority should you take a moratorium route.
And then, Dana, maybe you can speak to this, but like, I guess, do you have an estimate of how many like hours if we didn't do the moratorium, like of staff time it would take to do something like this?
Mayor, Councilmember Roberts, members of the council, I'm looking over at our community and economic development director. She might have actually a better idea.
Councilmember Roberts, are you talking about creating an ordinance, drafting an ordinance? I've got something started from local cities that I've gathered information from. Just so you're aware, I did reach out to all of Carver County cities as well to see what their plans were for this, and they're going through the exact same discussion as we are currently. They are seeing an increase in businesses wanting to open though, and there is an appetite to let things kind of just happen and wait till the 2025 mark. But I wouldn't see this taking us very much time to put this together, to be quite honest. Okay. We've got help from legal as well, which has been great. Sure. Mm-hmm.
And then I guess my only other comment would be regarding the potentially limiting it to one business per 12,500 residents. I guess my only concern, right, like I know eventually they'll be able to go anywhere, right? You can go to any other city and get this, but is there any concerns about basically saying, once there's one business there, now that's it, right? Like we're limiting it and it's basically a monopoly on it in Victoria, right? Like, so should it be more like two, so there's a little bit of competition? That's my only thought.
So Attorney Vos, on that issue, is this a may limit or must limit?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, so in other words, if you're going to impose a limit, must you impose the most restrictive limit that would be allowed? The answer, as I understand it, is no. A city could say, yes, we like the idea of a limit. We think that there shouldn't be any more than 3 retail marijuana stores in Victoria. We realize we could limit it to 1 currently and maybe 2 in the future, but yes, you could do that. You could establish a higher limit. Now, it's complicated in the sense that this, again, the county also has the authority to limit the total number countywide. And so there is some interplay you can appreciate between the county and all the cities in the county. And if all of the cities limit to 1, but the county allows 7, you know, there's some complicated math that has to be done. But yes, a city could limit generally to more than 1 per 12,500.
Councilmember Evansky, anything from you?
Not right now, Mayor.
Okay,
no.
Councilmember Gunderson, go ahead.
A follow-up on the number. What number are they using? Is it the census number, or is it when the city takes stock of how many residents are in the community? So meaning that for the next 10 years, we're at 10,000, whatever the sign says, and then
With the legislation.
Mayor and Council, that is a super knowable question. And
You're earning your billable hours tonight.
that is a super, if I had a better internet connection right now. I don't know. Does community development know? Yeah. Yes, between the two. It's one of the two you just identified, but I don't recall now.
Does the
Yeah.
legislation?
Yes.
It does.
My understanding is it
Okay,
does.
so
yeah.
we can get the
We can
answer
get
to
the-
that.
Yes.
I want to hear from Derek, but quick before we hear from him, let's talk money. So according to this, there is a state and a local share of revenue, of tax revenue. My source said something like the state gets 80% and the locals get 20%. Dana, do we have any sense of how that financial gymnastics is going to work?
Mayor, members of the council, I'm kind of eyeballing up Jen again. I don't recall reading or seeing anything in any of the information that I've come across related to that.
Derek,
Yeah.
come on forward. Let's hear from you. Can you state your name and, for the record, please, and tell us what you know?
Well, my name is Derek Smeagol. This is my wife, Tricia, who goes by Tish. As far as the and Mayor and City Council members, thank you very much for inviting us to this workshop. We're all in the very preliminary stages of this, and we're all learning daily on how things are going. Just to give you a little insight into the tax piece, because I do the taxes every month for our business, and we report that to the state. It's paid on the 20th of every month. So for January, on the February 20th, they withdraw money from my account. And currently, they just added a 10% tax to all THC beverage and gummies effective July 1st. So I had to go into the POS system, add 10% to all of those items that are applicable. And then when I do the taxes for July and August, that will be a separate line item that goes into that. So if the city gets 20% of that, it should come directly 20% from what I have turned in as a total number.
Okay.
All right,
So-
so that hopefully answers that question on
So
how-
you pay the total amount, and then they would kick back to us
That would be my guess.
okay, that's what I would think as well.
I don't see anything, the way it's set up now is there's a sales tax and then there's a Carver County tax of 0.5%.
Okay.
So the 7.38% total goes to the state. And I'm assuming that the state then dishes back the Carver County tax, which then from the THC sales, I'm sure would come back to the cities.
Okay, got it.
Unless there's a piece that goes to the county or something like that. My interpretation of what the research that I've done is that it was forgive me if I'm wrong, Attorney Voss, but it said that the state controls the licensing, and the cities determine up to 5 per 12,500 per five up to 5 locations. So I didn't know that they were restricted to just one. I thought it was up to 5 that they could do. Now, I don't know that you need 5 dispensaries in the city of Victoria, but I agree, you know, 1 or 2. A monopoly is not good for anybody, even though I would love that. It's just not right. I mean, I think, you know, the city of Victoria is big enough to where I just don't know where you would put something else. I mean, to have 2 dispensaries in downtown Victoria would seem a little redundant, but that's a decision for you all. So, a little background on us, though. So Tish and I have, we purchased the building back in 2014 in May, and we were just going to plan on being landlords. And then my beautiful wife said, you know, you've always wanted to open a cigar shop. And I said, wow, never really dawned on me, but yeah, let's look into it. So I had some friends in the industry and looked into it, and we opened in August of 2014. So I'm inviting you all right now. August 17th, we have our 9th anniversary. We have a pig roast, corn boil, and everything going on over there, so you're all invited. So luckily, we've been in business for going on 9 years, and it's been a struggle at times, but we've been able to keep it going. We picked up Delta 8 2 years ago when it was legalized, and that did pretty well. And then that was discontinued or made to go away once the THC stuff started last July. And we are very strict with our business. Nobody is allowed under 21. We have only had 1 ticket in 9 years, and that was from an employee that was new, and we took disciplinary action, but we are very, very strict at carding everybody that comes in. We also have a no consumption policy with any of the THC beverages or gummies on premise. So it's strictly a takeout, take home. We don't want the liability. We're not an on-premise establishment we do sell 3-2, but that's a little different from what we're dealing with here. So we're very strict with that and don't allow that consumption on premise. I recently talked about the taxes at 10%. What we find is our products that we offer are beneficial to both our existing customer base and new customers. It's brought in a ton of new business, which is good for, you know, if you're getting 20% tax, that's great for the city. And currently it's growing to about 15% of our total business, which in a year is pretty impressive. I think it just continues to grow, the excitement around the product, the benefits that people are finding out about the product. And as I said, we're still in the very infancy stages of this whole new ruling, if you will. In fact, I found out about the taxes the morning that the taxes went into play. It was like, whoa, wait a minute. So that was a little hairy for my Saturday morning, but and then I understand also that it's quite expensive, the application fees and the process to go through this with the state. They're still, I mean, there is no application right now. They're still building this stuff. So it's good to know that we're getting in front of this so that when it does actually hit, we can move forward. But it would be a significant investment on our part to get into this business, not only from an application standpoint, but just making adjustments to our business, hiring, security, safes. It's an all-cash business. I mean, there's a lot of things that would take place. Right now, the plan is to have our upstairs turned into the dispensary piece. I would like to keep the cigar business as is if we can. The dispensaries we visited in other states that are legal have a very interesting concept where you initially come in, you give a driver's license, they run a check, make sure everything's cool. You're then in a waiting room, a person comes out with an iPad, walks you up to the display counters. All of the inventory is displayed under glass. You point to what you want, they plug it into an iPad, that iPad sends it to a back room. That person in the back puts the order together, comes through a window, you're rung up, and away you go. So it's very different from the cigar industry, and I'd like to keep that separate, obviously from an LLC standpoint and just from a business standpoint, keeping the two separate. So right now, as I said, there's just still a lot of questions. We're looking into things as much as I can on the internet, contacting folks. I'm very good friends with Jim Nash. He's kind of keeping me in the loop on a few things. He's opposed to this, by the way, which is okay. And you know, we're looking to move forward from here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Do you have any sense about how distribution, I mean, currently, like liquor laws, we have a liquor distribution, and I'm sure the same is true for cigars and that sort of thing. Did the same rules hold true for cannabis? And if we're not ready yet with the Office of Cannabis, and we say Victoria is going to go ahead anyway, do you have a way to get your hands on product and you can start selling it?
I can't start selling it until 2025. But
Okay.
currently, I have probably at least 1 to 3 reps a week that are coming in, dropping off samples for gummies or beverages. I have a pretty limited supply, but I think I'm selling 5 different beverages, and I sell 2 brands of gummies that are pretty much cover the gamut as far as flavors and everything else. I mean, a 5 milligram gummy is the same whether you're, one person or another. There's still 5 milligrams. The one thing that's interesting is that I've been very strict also on limiting our products to 5 milligrams. There are brands out there right now, for example, they'll have a 16 or a 24-ounce can that'll say, well, there's 120 milligrams in here, but it's all lined on the outside of the can where the 5 milligram gum, where the 5 milligrams are. I'm like, how do you even measure that? You can't. So knowing that I want to get into this longer term, I've been very responsible and very conservative on what we're selling and making sure that we're not breaking any rules or getting past anything. As far as supply, we focus on Minnesota grown right now, and we do have 1 Colorado gummy, and the rest of them are pretty much here. I sell Surly, Indeed, and Sundog, which are all Minnesota brands.
Okay, so the cannabis can't be sold until 2025.
Correct. January of 2025.
So,
what is the point of?
yeah, what's the point of us
not doing
licensing
more?
it now
That's,
if it can't be sold?
Can you build?
Mayor, I nodded my head at that. Yeah, no, I think sorry, I've forgotten your name, but
Derek.
Derek is making the assumption based on, I think, the trend among a lot of cities that many cities are going to adopt these moratoriums through 2025. But it could be made legal if a city didn't do that and didn't step into the regulatory arena. That would be legal. The state will be issuing licenses before that. So Derek's business could theoretically, if you didn't adopt a moratorium and didn't adopt regulations that interfered with this business, he could be selling the full strength, what I call the full strength marijuana products before 2025.
Oh, so he could do it under our authority, licensing authority.
Yeah, no, Mayor, Council, because you didn't adopt a moratorium last go around, is my recollection. I'm right about that, right? Yeah. So, and you don't have anything in place today. So if you were to do nothing, sort of wait for the state to regulate, it would be legal as soon as the state made it legal by issuing a license to a business like Derek's business. So it would be under state authority that he'd be.
But we could do it sooner if we wanted to do the regulation even, right? Like, because when's the date that, is it August, right? So technically.
Oh, I see what you
Like, you know what I
no.
mean? Like if we put in, like if the
No.
staff took.
No. No. So yes, no, the legal sale of what I'm calling full strength, above the 5 milligram gummies that Derek's talking about, that will not be legal until the state starts issuing licenses. So While you could have a regulatory scheme in place, there won't be any practical effect to that until there is a legalized route to selling those full-strength products.
So is there a reason why we would not do a moratorium then? Because if they can't do it with the state, then there's really no reason not.
Mayor and council, I'm not here to pick sides in this argument or this discussion. So, but, that's the conclusion that I think a lot of cities are reaching. But
Okay.
yeah,
Is we do nothing, but then
adopt a moratorium. And a lot of, I think I'm not hiding the ball here. Most of our clients, I believe, will adopt a moratorium. I mean, I think I can say that with some confidence. That's we had a municipal group meeting where all the attorneys representing the 40-plus cities were in attendance, and everyone reported either they had already drafted for their client cities a moratorium ordinance, or they had been directed to do so. So most of the cities we're working with are headed toward adopting a moratorium.
But would there be any difference if we didn't adopt a moratorium because they can't sell it till the state licenses it anyways?
Well, so again, as I said, I think the state's rules could be in place as soon as 4 months from now, which would be, before the end of the year even. And the state could start issuing licenses shortly after that. And so then it would be legal. So there will be a 1 year, at most, you're right though, there would be about a 1 year gap between legalization by the state issuing licenses and the end of the potential moratorium period. That period is irrelevant because if a city doesn't want to get into the regulatory arena at all, I guess it's going to be legal when it is, right? It's going to be legal when businesses can start getting the licenses.
So from my perspective, what we're wrestling with here is, I'm going to let Derek sit back down again unless somebody has another question for him. Thank you. So from my perspective, what we're wrestling with here is how much control do we want to have over these businesses? And we should write an ordinance that says if we only want one per 2,500 people, we should write an ordinance that says that. If we don't want anything within whatever, a mile of the playground, we should write an ordinance that says that.
Yeah. Mayor and council, I understand that the point you're making about sort of what is the question that you're wrestling with. And again, I always try to stay out of telling you what I think you should do. I should try to just give you legal advice. The thinking that I have heard through colleagues, among my 8 or 9 cities, no city yet has adopted a moratorium. But the thinking that I've heard from a couple of other cities I work with, and then collectively among the cities that we work with, is I don't know, I as a council member for City X, don't know enough yet about what the scope of city authority is going to be. I don't know what this time, place, and manner means. I don't know how this business is really going to look as it rolls out, and so I don't know what the practical concerns are for my community. So I sort of don't know enough yet what I should be worried about in order to adopt a sensible set of laws to deal with that. I don't know enough yet. And that's as far as the rationale goes for saying I should just wait. I, as a council member, would like to wait until later, until the state agency does something, tells me something more about how this is going to look. I just want to wait. I just want to put everything on hold to hear how the state is going to let cities be in this game and how cities can regulate.
How often or how quickly do they usually, right? So when they finally have that document, right, that says here are all the rules, right? Does it drop and now it's game on, or do we usually see that a month before it's gonna drop? How does that usually, I guess, work so that staff then has time to say, okay, this is once that's drops and it's legal, now we want to be ahead of the game so that we have our rules in place and when that moratorium goes away.
Mayor and council, it sounds like I'm pandering, but these are really smart questions. So congratulations to you for having smart questions about this topic. But the answer to your question, you asked, how does this usually go? How it usually goes is a state agency, whether it's a new one or it's just adopting rules in a new area. Usually when the rules are enacted, adopted, made, put in place, the rules are in place immediately and the impact of those rules is immediate. And in this context, cities need to react to that sort of immediately because the rules are in place and legal. I think this may be a different situation because I think there's enough money at stake and I think there's enough of a new industry emergence at stake, that there could be litigation, right? I think that the state rules ultimately could lead to a lawsuit over what the rules say, whether it's by cities or the marijuana industry or some other interest group, I don't know. But I think there's some real potential for there to be litigation, which of course, as you well know, has the potential to slow down the implementation of these rules. So I don't know if I'm getting at your question though, but the rules, my sense is the rules are going to probably take several months to more than several months, 6 months, something like that, to get put in place. And then if that were to happen within, let's say, 6 months, licenses could start issuing at that point, and the full strength marijuana would be legal. It will be legal everywhere. But it will be subject to, at that point, whatever restrictions a city has in place. And if a city has a moratorium in place, even though the state is now issuing licenses, you won't be able to set up a new retail business in a city with a moratorium until, at the soonest, 2025. So a city that has a moratorium will be able to see the rules get rolled out, potentially see them get sued over or not, see what they say, and have some period of time to decide what to do. And that, what I just said there, is the reason why I think a lot of cities are looking at moratorium.
Could we take away that moratorium, or we can take that moratorium away earlier though? So if once they drop it, we have our moratorium on, and then 2 weeks later, or a month later, if we have our rules in place, ready to, we could say, no, we're dropping the moratorium.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, absolutely. I mean, that's true of every moratorium. This is a little bit of, there's some unique language in this about this kind of moratorium, but that's exactly right. And I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to be, there's no secret behind the curtain here. The thing that the cities that we work with are most waiting for, yes, the regulations matter, and yes, what the state agency does is important, but what they're really waiting for is this model ordinance. The fact of the matter is, I mean, I'm speculating a little bit, but the fact of the matter is, I believe around the state we have 850 cities. The cities that ultimately adopt regulations of marijuana are going to adopt ordinances that are quite similar to that model ordinance. There will be a model set of regulations that are adopted in a lot of places around the state of Minnesota that look very similar. So I think that's what cities are waiting for.
Thank you.
This is a whole big bucket of we don't know.
A moratorium limits just the sale of the product. Is that what it is? My question is getting to how, if we have a business that wants to get into it, are they able to do all the development they need to set up the space to create, to be ready to sell it? So instead of, no, you can't do anything, well, you can get your space ready. You can bring in the products that are not THC containing and the items that go along, all the things that go along with it.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, the moratorium is on the city of Victoria, whereas the city to adopt a moratorium here, from doing anything to process the moving forward of a new business. And I say it that way because the moratorium would, here's the example that's been talked about. I don't know that this exists in Victoria, I doubt that it does, but there are places around the state that have been growing marijuana legally for a long time, right? As long as it's been, medicinal marijuana has been legal in Minnesota for some period of time, and so somebody's been growing it in Minnesota. That is legal now and would remain legal under the terms of the moratorium that our office has drafted and that a bunch of cities are going to look at adopting. Those businesses would remain legal, and in fact, expanding those businesses would theoretically be legal. It would be legal to make a bigger, have more plots of land involved in the growing of medicinal marijuana would be legal. So there is a fairly big exemption in this moratorium for businesses that exist today that are doing something legal today, okay? And so what's prohibited is the city giving any new license to Derek, for example, to expand his business to include the sale of full-strength marijuana products, or to do anything else related to that he might have to do with his store to sell those products. So
if we don't adopt a moratorium, can anybody else who is interested in entering this business theoretically set up shop and be ready to blink on when it's good to go, if we don't put in place some kind of limitation on the number of stores that we want, the number of dispensaries, the number of retailers?
Mayor and Council, there were two ifs in that one. So, but if both of those ifs turned out to be true, then yes, what you said is right. That if you did nothing and didn't set anything up, and if a business came along and wanted to set up shop and be ready to go, And if ultimately down the road you didn't adopt regulations that would limit that business, then that business could start selling when they got a state license, which will happen at some indefinite time in the future, which I can't predict.
Sure.
Sorry, I feel like we keep asking the same questions, but like, so, but I just want to make sure. So using real, right? So Derek's here, right? We'll talk about Derek, right? So he talked about building his upstairs for that spot, right? So if we did a moratorium, he could not build that out currently because its intended use would be for the sale of, is that what you're saying, or am I misunderstanding what you're saying?
He could build it out, stock it up.
It's already built out.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
So that's why I would love for all of you to come by on the 17th of August or anytime to see the facility. Upstairs is strictly for, it's basically open. I've got one storage room that would be where I would hold the inventory and put a window in that room. The rest of it is wide open, so it would be a matter of moving furniture out and putting in display cases and a counter to bring people up. That's it. So the other piece would be making sure that I have enough room for people to come in, to have somebody there to take their license. And I don't know what the state is going to require. Some states you walk in and it would be like walking into our cigar shop and seeing a bunch of jars. Okay, I want 2 ounces of that or whatever. But I like the other side of that, which is, being very upfront, getting the information, making sure that everything is in one room and not sitting out for anybody to tamper with. And that would be the way that I would move forward. So there isn't anything as far as, and as Jen and I were talking, had emailed back and forth, it's like, well, what do you need to do? And I said, I really don't need to do anything. Cut a hole in the wall and put up a counter. That's pretty much it. And close the entry off. We do have access from the inside to go upstairs, so that would be closed off. So it would be a completely separate business.
So it would have a separate entrance and everything?
Yeah,
Okay.
the door's already there.
Right.
There were 2 separate buildings or 2 separate levels to begin with, and then we opened it up once we decided to allow the smoking inside. So.
And I want to be fair to that question because I think it's another, pandering here again, another really good question, hard question. I mean, I think that if you came to the city like Victoria and said, I want to set up a new business and I need to pull a building permit because I'm going to build out a new space to do it, the building official is going to say, well, tell me about what you're going to do here, because what you're going to do here impacts what the building code says about it, right? And so how granular is that exchange going to be with the building official? I mean, I don't know the answer to that question, right? I mean, I don't know how far your building official takes the answer. I'm going to be in a retail business and I'm going to sell stuff, and this is kind of what the stuff is. And
It could be the 3-2.
yeah,
right.
So, right. So I think candidly, in a practical way, it would be quite difficult to say you can't build out a new storefront in Victoria because you haven't told us in the most concrete and discreet way possible exactly everything you're going to sell there. I mean, that's pretty hard to say no to a building permit on that basis, so.
All right, council.
It feels like we kind of need to just do them more. I mean, I kind of lean toward a moratorium at this point because there's nothing to do until the state gives us guidance.
Yeah.
I mean, until like I was thinking like, no, we could go forward, right? Like, and if that was the case,
Right.
I was like, maybe we don't. But
Well, understanding that we probably can't, we're not going to hold up any progress you guys are making because you got to wait for the state to issue a license. But I think from our perspective, I think it behooves us to think a little bit about what do we want this to look like in the city of Victoria? How many of these do we want? Do we have any specificity around where we place these? So, I would kind of like to take a look at an ordinance that does that.
we can do that work when we're doing them, or while we're on a moratorium, we can be doing that work, right? So that we're ready to go once the state gives us those guidelines.
Councilmember Gunderson, what's on your mind?
I just hate for us to do
So-
stuff that's in contradictory to what the state does.
Yeah.
Right. I get all that. Part of it goes back to I don't want any already established Victoria businesses that want to get into it, like Derek's, miss the wave of establishing customers and clientels for future use. And I speak from talking to businesses in states where it's already legal, where dispensaries that where they were already to go when it was legal, there was a big rush. And the ones that were established that we helped, or that communities helped succeed at it, didn't flash out or panic, just didn't go away because once the wave left. And I don't want a Victoria business to miss that wave of establishing a clientele. So I don't lean towards the moratorium in the case that we're not 12,500 yet. And once the novelty of it being legal wears off, I'd like to see Derek's business succeed in that way. And then I think by the time he is able to sell it, and that the novelty's worn off, I think we will be in line with it. We won't have too many. We won't have an overabundance of them, and we'll know more about it. But it gives us an opportunity with one, because we're not at 12,500, and we don't know if we're going to be there at the end of the year. So that gives us until probably 2025 as it is, with just one store.
That's not a must, that's a may.
Right. And
So we could say, we understand that we can limit it to one, but we really think it's in our best interest to go to 3.
right. However many we decide is right. But we have one business that if it were if licensing, if it were to happen today, he would be ready to go.
Mayor, members of the council, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make a note too about the zoning piece of it. We didn't really discuss that, but typically you're seeing these in your CBD areas, so no pun intended there, but we don't have much available space currently in our CBD right now. And as we start building out other areas in our community, it might then grow. But as of now, we may only see the one business with the space and availability that we have. So just pointing out the zoning piece of it too.
I don't know, part of me is just like, though, even if we're doing work in the background during a moratorium, right? Like, once that state thing comes out, you do your comparison, you say, okay, we need to make these edits. I mean, you should be able to be, because I don't know, I understand what you're saying.
Because as it is now, Dana, don't we just say we don't have a process to license you, so we can't license you?
I didn't hear the question.
If somebody other than Derek, were to come to you and say, I want to sell marijuana in Victoria, you'd be like, we don't have a licensing mechanism to do that yet, so you can't do it.
I think we would follow the same process that we've followed here for this.
What was that process, I guess?
Well, whatever we decide that process.
Right, but we don't have a licensing mechanism for that right now, so we couldn't issue a license as it is. So until we put a process in place, the moratorium is, it's kind of we don't have a process, we don't have a process, so you can't do it until we get a process and make it ready to go.
But to Councilmember Roberts' point, a moratorium would give us the opportunity to work through what our ordinance could be, what we would want that to look like. So,
Mayor, if I
yes, please. Attorney Vos, please.
Gunderson. I think that's not correct. So Derek's business, for example, currently is selling the kind of legalized low-level THC products that were made legal 2 sessions ago, despite the fact that we don't have a process and we don't have a moratorium. That's because it was made legal, and he doesn't need approval from the city unless the city has established a regime that requires city approval. So, and that would be the same with the higher strength products. If the higher strength products in Victoria aren't subject to a moratorium and are not subject to any time, place, and manner restrictions, there just is no local regulation at all, then when the state issues a license in the future, that business can establish itself here and doesn't need the city's approval to do that.
And as many as the market will bear show up here.
Up to a limit that would be imposed. I suspect the county is going to have its own county-wide limit, so up to that point, yes. And I think Derek's right that there is a state statutory limit. I think he mentioned 5. I don't recall if it's 5 or not per municipality, but I think there's a statutory limit, a maximum that is more than 1 per 12,500. So we'd have to look into that. But more than a few could establish themselves here if the city does nothing.
This has been a very robust conversation. Let me see if I can understand what our choices are. So we could direct the staff to go ahead and draft an ordinance based on some of the research that they've done and what they're seeing other cities do for us to consider at a future date. We could implement a moratorium at this point in time, or I think we could also table this and get some more information and then come back and chat about it some more. So council, do we have any consensus on how we want to proceed from here?
Well, I'll just state that
Councilmember Ivansky, you are here tonight.
I'm supportive of a moratorium for a number of reasons. One, I feel that model form ordinances published by the state is a smart business decision for cities to make. It will serve to tone down the patchwork of legislation that could be popping up. And when all these different rules are in place, there's not a level playing field. I heard great things from Derek on how to responsibly manage this business. Some of those features may be in the regulations. I hope some of them are, so that he can have a business where he has a level playing field against his competitors. And then likewise, absent a rule book, a framework, I don't want to see you making investments of money into things that could just be a complete waste of your resources, and that's not a smart choice either. So with a moratorium, I feel like, everybody's at a pause, everybody's all in the same level playing field. The state comes in, gives their guidance on how this is. I mean, the liquor is licensed, and has a consistent way of approach, except if you're running a municipal liquor store. The process is the same for acquiring alcoholic beverages, whether I'm in Eden, so I shouldn't have taken Eden Prairie because they license it. But, if I go to Carver or if I go to Victoria, it's by and large the same process. And I'd like to see consistency both for business owners and consumers, that we have a level playing field, and then we can talk about the number of dispensaries that will allow. I mean, the part of me also wants the model that we've heard is a good model. And I'm just hopeful that the regulations will guide towards those decisions, and we don't get people who want to take a laissez-faire attitude towards it and just, sell it to any 21-year-old that's going to go light up downstairs. So that's kind of like where I'm weighing in on.
Derek, why don't you come? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mayor and council members. I just want to understand, because Councilmember Roberts, I think you made a point that even if there is a moratorium, if something did change where the guidelines came from the state, you all agreed on it, that we could move forward prior to that. Is that how I understood
Prior
that?
to the end of the moratorium?
Well, my understanding was the moratorium is in place until you decide it's not in place.
Correct.
So
That's true,
There's
yes.
not a time frame that you must abide by. So if 6 months into this, the state comes out with regulations that you all have an opportunity to approve, add whatever the city's additions would be to that, then we could move forward sooner than a July or a January 2025 date. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, by law, a moratorium that Victoria might adopt can only extend through January 1 of 2025. That's the longest the moratorium can be. The city could repeal, a moratorium is an ordinance. The city could repeal that ordinance whenever the city wants to.
And to
Thanks for clarifying, because I mean, I think that's sort of just reinforces the point that I made. Once, if the state, and we're just going to say like by divine intervention, because I think that sadly they're going to take the runway that they've been given on it. But if they adopt model regulations early, and those seem to be acceptable for the needs of our community, I don't have an issue with repealing our moratorium at that time.
And to his point, I just want to make sure, so like when we do start thinking about our regulations, so to Greg's point, you know, they mentioned they're going to have a separate entrance, so we could put, like, if that's not in the state's rules, if that's something we wanted, that's something we could potentially say is like, if you're a store that sells something else, you have to have a separate entrance for cannabis. Is that something like the city will be able to do, or we don't know at this point?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, I think that goes to Council members' great point about time, place, and manner. What does manner or place maybe even, is that going to be within that regulatory authority or not? The rules are going to speak to that, I think. So, yeah.
Okay, so knowing that, I appreciate Councilmember Evansky's point about patchwork regulation, and I think that is it's a good point to have been brought up. So having said that, we can put a moratorium in place, knowing we can repeal it at any time, that we're ready to go. And at that time, take a look at the model ordinance, find out what we want to add to it.
Do we want staff to work on having something so it's ready to go right when it comes out, so that we're not, I don't want to say caught off guard, because I don't think we'll be caught off guard, because it sounds like we already have stuff kind of already started, but you know, whether we have a document and then it's basically, okay, review the state, and okay, we have to change this, or we have to do this, or we don't need this.
Is that a little cart before the horse, Ms. Burrington?
I don't think so.
It's reasonable to expect that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the last question I have is a moratorium going to affect your business? If we do this, what are your thoughts on it? I mean, we do this and we have a moratorium. Is it going to affect your business or this particular segment of your business?
Mayor and Council, I don't think it's going to affect our existing business. The one concern I have is I sat down at the once the moratorium is lifted, would I have some kind of notice that, you know, a 30-day notice or a 60-day notice that the moratorium will be lifted on this date to be able to prepare so that when it is lifted, I'm ready to go. That, I guess, is my biggest concern, because what I don't want to do is, like on the taxes, wake up one morning and say, hey, the moratorium's lifted, and then I'm
Be scrambling.
Scrambling, yeah. So that
Tish, get in the
is,
car,
I guess,
hurry.
what, you know, my biggest concern would be about that. Just having the whatever time frame you feel is necessary.
It seems like we're a little at the mercy of the state, though,
Well,
because
right.
depending if they give us, you know, if they don't give us any time and they
Then-
just drop it, then
We've done sunset things in the past. We did it with ATVs in Victoria. If we put a sunset date on it to revisit it, that would give him a date that either the moratorium goes away or another notice that it's being extended.
Well, there is a de facto sunset date. It's
I mean, he knows that.
January
2025. I mean, it's,
But if it comes, that's the longest we can do it. So if
that's the longest, right. So
we set one for January, you know, the first meeting in January, to revisit it and say, where are we at from July of last year?
I mean,
Well,
I guess I would tout Jen. I mean, it sounds
yeah,
like, I know
Ms.
she talks
Burrington.
to our businesses a lot, right? I'm assuming if we heard something, you would start giving him the heads up that
Yes.
this is coming, so.
City staff and legal will be monitoring it pretty closely. I mean, it's a hot topic right now, and we're getting calls from other cities and other city managers and what's going on. So, and we've been working really closely with these folks. So, I mean, we'd be happy to stay in communication with that piece.
yeah, I think, you know, I think it's true. We are going to be at the mercy of the state a little bit once they get that rulemaking done, but that's usually a pretty laborious process. And to Attorney Bosa's point, there's a lot of people who want to weigh in on how that looks and sounds. So we should have some idea about how that's going once it gets started. So we'll be able to give that. So, okay, so I'm hearing consensus on a moratorium. I'm seeing head nods, yeah.
Yep.
All right, let's prepare a moratorium that, knowing that we can repeal it as quickly as we put it in place, if the need comes. All right, that was a great discussion. All right, council, seeing no further discussion, can I get a motion to adjourn this workshop?
I'll make a motion to adjourn the workshop.
I get a motion, can I get a second?
Second.
Councilmember Roberts seconds. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We stand adjourned, and we will be back in 5 minutes to take on the council meeting.